Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me for the news summary for day 390 of the war in Ukraine. You are listening to The Account. First up, due to personal circumstances, I'm a little short on time. I will still do a proper and fairly extensive report, however, some parts will be rushed. I will provide all material to check up on the details though, if you're interested. Today I have two extra segments for you. One with additional updates on the International Criminal Court arrest warrant and the visit to Moscow by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Otherwise, all updates are grouped into the usual: situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, and international developments. First though, the flashpoints along the front. Bakhmut. Even though no significant advances are reported, heavy fighting continues in and around Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin has sent a letter to Russian Defense Minister Serhii Shoigu asking for help and claiming Ukraine is planning a massive counteroffensive. Hanna Maliar, Deputy Minister of Defense, stated that Ukrainian defenders are destroying Russia's most professional units in the battle for Bakhmut. Avdiivka. The situation around Avdiivka is deteriorating. For the second day in a row, the General Staff reported attacks on Berdichi, which lies behind Stepove. This could indicate that Russia either captured Stepove or managed to go around it. Oleksiy Dmitrashkivsky, spokesman for the Joint Press Office of the Armed Forces of the Tavria Front, stated the situation in Avdiivka could become similar to the one in Bakhmut. And to start the news segment, a look at Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Moscow, where he has a meeting scheduled with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Xi Jinping has spoken about his attitude to the situation in Ukraine on the eve of his visit to Russia and stated that China is prepared to stand guard over the world order together with Russia. CNN reported that the Chinese leader has praised Beijing's growing ties with Moscow while also attempting to present China as a peacemaker in the war. Next up, the latest regarding the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. Dmitry Peskov, press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, has commented on the issuance of an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin by the International Criminal Court, stating that it was yet another hostile display toward Russia and Putin did not take it to heart. Meanwhile, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Karim Khan, said that the warrant issued is for life. The deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, has threatened the judges with a missile strike for issuing the arrest warrant, while the Investigative Committee of Russia stated that it had opened a case against members of the International Criminal Court. The Verkhovna Rada has adopted a statement on the issue of bringing the Russian leadership to justice for crimes in Ukraine, in particular to implement the decision of the International Criminal Court to arrest Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. The International Criminal Court will also plead for extra money to investigate Russian war crimes in Ukraine. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. Oleksiy Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, stated that the estimation of losses of the defense forces of Ukraine published by Politico do not correspond to reality, and Russia is losing many times more soldiers than Ukraine in combat. We do not have 100,000 casualties among the military. It is impossible, he said. Czech President Petr Pavel has suggested that Ukraine should use the opportunity for a counteroffensive this year, as it will be extremely difficult to get help from its allies for another attempt in the future. The Security Service of Ukraine has exposed underground cells of the so-called Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Kiev and 6 other oblasts of the country. The Verkhovna Rada officially dismissed Education Minister Serhii Moskalenko, Strategic Industries Minister Pavlo Ryabikin, and Digital Transformation Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. During the visit of Russian President Vladimir Putin to the occupied city of Mariupol and his communication with alleged residents, someone shouted in the background, "It's all lies, it's all for show." The Ukrainian resistance has reported that all blood from civilian blood transfusion centers has been taken for the needs of the Russian military in the Russian-occupied city of Sevastopol in Crimea. The city is also experiencing a shortage of medicines for civilians. Serhii Moskalenko, the chief of a detention center involved in the torture of local residents, was killed on March 17th in the occupied part of Kherson Oblast. During an extended meeting of the board of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, President Vladimir Putin stated the need to promptly create police structures in the occupied Ukrainian territories with the involvement of the local population. Several explosions were reported in Dzhanki, occupied Crimea. Local residents suggested a drone was shot down. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. Employees of the Russian presidential administration have been instructed to replace iPhones with smartphones of other brands and with a different operating system by the end of March. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner PMC, is demanding punishment for anyone who refuses to bury dead Wagner mercenaries. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. EU ministers have agreed a plan to jointly procure 1 million shells for Ukraine, according to the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas. Boris Pistorius, head of the Ministry of Defense of Germany, said that the German Marder infantry fighting vehicles, the transfer of which Berlin announced in January, are already on their way to Ukraine. US President Joe Biden's administration has announced the allocation of an additional military assistance package for Ukraine, including more ammunition for HIMARS and howitzers, HARM missiles, and other equipment. The Norwegian Armed Forces announced the delivery of 8 Leopard 2 tanks and 4 support vehicles to Ukraine. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defense. Over the past 3 weeks, Russian forces have made creeping gains around the Ukrainian-held Donbas town of Avdiivka, immediately north of Donetsk city. The Russian operation has largely been carried out by the 1st Army Corps of the Donetsk People's Republic, local personnel who will know the terrain well. Avdiivka has been on the front line of the Donbas conflict since 2014. The city is now largely destroyed. The sprawling Avdiivka coke plant complex is likely to be seen as particularly defendable key terrain as the battle progresses. Tactically, the situation is similar to that in the larger town of Bakhmut further north. Ukrainian forces continue organized defense, but their supply lines to the west are increasingly threatened by the Russian envelopment operation. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. ISW is publishing an abbreviated campaign update today, March 19th. This report discusses growing Russian concern about a prospective Ukrainian counteroffensive near Bakhmut or in southern Ukraine, and Russian efforts to prepare mitigations for these claimed efforts. The tempo of Russian offensive operations across the theater has slowed in recent weeks, suggesting that the Russian spring offensive in Donbas may be nearing culmination. Ukrainian officials have indicated that significant Russian losses near Vuhledar are severely inhibiting Russian forces' capacity to conduct further offensive operations in Donetsk Oblast. Russian President Vladimir Putin used his first visit to recently occupied Ukraine to portray himself as an involved wartime leader amid exaggerated responses in the Russian nationalist information space over fears of a possible future Ukrainian counteroffensive in southern Ukraine. As this is a lengthy abbreviated update and I'm a bit short on time, I will state the main topic headlines instead of writing a summary. Ukrainian forces likely conducted a localized counterattack southwest of Bakhmut amid growing Russian discussion about a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area. Statements made by Ukrainian military officials on the pace and prospects of current Russian offensive operations may suggest that the overall Russian spring offensive may be nearing culmination. The overall Russian spring offensive is thus likely approaching culmination. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited occupied Mariupol on March 19th, likely to project the image of invulnerability and to continue efforts to portray himself as an involved wartime leader. Putin's Mariupol visit likely also aimed to assuage a long-standing and pervasive fear in the nationalist space about a prospective Ukrainian counteroffensive in southern Ukraine. Former Russian officer, convicted war criminal, and prominent critical nationalist mill blogger Igor Girkin indicated that there are likely deepening fractures within the top levels of Russian military leadership. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The level of missile threat remains high throughout the territory of Ukraine. In the Kupiansk and Liman directions, the enemy carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of Novoselivsk. In the direction of Bakhmut, the occupiers do not stop trying to seize the city of Bakhmut. Constant positional battles continue there. At the same time, our defenders repelled enemy attacks in Danilov and Ivanivsk districts. In the Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shahtarsk directions, the enemy carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of the settlements of Berdichi, Avdiivka, and Siverne. The enemy is defending in the Zaporizhia and Kherson direction. As they continue to suffer huge losses, the Russian invaders are setting up more and more of their hospitals along the contact line. So, in the village of Rosivka of the temporarily occupied territory of the Zaporizhia Oblast, one of these institutions of the occupiers is located in the building of the local hospital. Over the past day, about 50 seriously wounded servicemen of the Russian army were brought here. Also, in the village of Vysoke, Zaporizhia Oblast, the occupiers set up a hospital in the building of a local school. During March 19th, a large number of seriously wounded were brought there. For this, the enemy used 4 medical trucks based on Kamaz vehicles. And with that, the report is finished. If you're interested in details, you can find links to every article I mentioned in the description as usual. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.